All right, welcome to this week's edition of Talks at New Haven. I'm your host, Josh Robinson, and joining me today, as always, is my co-host,
Alton Booth.
And on today's episode, Alton and I are going to be discussing the great flood story from Genesis chapter 7. We're going to set a little bit of the background from Genesis chapter 6 since we didn't have an episode of Talks at New Haven last week, so we'll kind of summarize what we would have talked about last week, and then that ought to get us into Genesis chapter 7, and we're going to be discussing things like, was the flood real? Like, do other flood myths around the world disprove the biblical flood story? And we're just going to dive into some of the more interesting details in the text, really just see where today's episode goes. So if you guys have a Bible, you can go ahead and open up to Genesis chapter 7. We'll start with verse 1, and we'll work our way through the entire chapter. But before we do that, Alton, how you doing today, pal?
Doing pretty good. Tired. It's been a long week.
No kidding.
Been a really long week. I know for both of us.
I've had better.
Yeah. It's been a long week for both of us for different reasons.
Right. Yeah.
But before we dig into Genesis, let's go ahead and we do have some news about the podcast.
Yeah, we talked about that before we
share
come
with
on.
everybody.
Yeah.
So if you're watching the video right now, you'll see right up here, right up there above my head, a new logo.
Yeah.
For Talks at New Haven.
Right.
So we're changing things up just a little bit. We're going with a new logo. We're actually starting a separate Instagram account for Talks at New Haven. So if you're watching, if you're listening, go find that, give it a like, and we will have that. We're also going to start every 2 weeks. So every other Thursday, we're going to release an audio only Talks at New Haven. And it's not going to be part of our Genesis series right now.
Yeah.
It's going to be more of a current events, current topics, that kind of thing. Just 25, 30 minutes of us talking about whatever we have on our mind, whatever's going on, that kind of thing.
Kind of like whatever's going on in the world of Christendom at the moment, that kind of thing. We talked about it a little bit before today's episode, so that should be interesting. We kind of kicked around a couple different ideas, but I think that ought to be interesting. Kind of gives just some commentary to maybe some things going on around the world, and kind of how we should maybe think about some of those things, that kind of thing. So that should be fairly interesting, and we're planning on doing that every other week. So we'll probably record those while we're here, and that way that we just have them already ready to roll, and we'll just schedule them to release. And
because there's a lot of stuff going on that I would love for us to get a chance to talk about.
Yeah.
But the format we're currently using doesn't really give us that opportunity.
Yeah, that's right.
So it'll be better once we're able to do that. We're able to talk about things outside of the series that we're on at the time.
Yeah.
So that'll be fun. I hope people enjoy those. Like I said, those are going to be audio only.
Yeah.
So if you want those, you're going to have to subscribe to the Talks at New Haven podcast feed.
Oh, so you're pointing people to the podcast.
I know usually we don't even mention that we have a podcast.
Right.
But you have to subscribe to the podcast feed. You can find us Talks at New Haven on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, about anywhere you can find a podcast.
Yeah.
You can find us there.
Yeah. Also, make sure to head over to Talks at New Haven on Instagram, like you were talking about. That ought to give you a link tree, probably starting this week, of all the different places that you can find information for Talks at New Haven. It'll also direct you back to New Haven Church and some of the, obviously what we're doing here in our local church. So it should be a kind of a hub so that you can find all of that stuff to make it a little bit easier. So. All right. Well, good stuff. All right. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and read the text for us. And we can kind of jump right into it. And then, so this is Moses writing Genesis, and he says, "The Lord said to Noah, 'Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of animals that are not clean, the male and his mate. The 7 pairs of the 7 birds of heaven, also male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground.' And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came upon the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood, of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground. 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, and on the 17th day of the month. And on that day, all of the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. And rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Very repetitious, right? And on the very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and his three wives of his sons, with them that entered the ark, they and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kinds, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, every winged creature, they all went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female, of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all of the high mountains under the whole of heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, and all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land, in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died. He, being God, blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals, and creeping things, and birds of the heavens, and they were blotted out on the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark, and the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. So, Alton, to get us started, did the flood happen? Was it real?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That really is a good question to ask.
Yeah.
So we'll start with that question first.
Okay.
Did the flood happen? Was it real?
Yep.
And I'll tell a story that I told you right before we came on.
Yep.
I was in a history class in college, and the history professor was talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then he was talking about somebody else's flood story.
Yep.
And he said, so obviously these different cultures having flood stories that aren't exactly the same
Right.
is proof that none of the flood stories are true.
Interesting logic. Let's see how it works out for him, Cotton.
Right, so I was like, how far do you have to disengage your brain to get to the point that, okay, all of these civilizations that have lived for centuries without contact with each other all have a similar story of a flood.
Yeah.
And come to the conclusion, they're all fake.
Right. Every one of them that never had contact with one another. Right?
Right. That leads me to believe that, okay, at least one of them's true.
Right.
Now, you're not... That set of evidence, all of them having different stories, is not necessarily going to say that the biblical story's true.
Right.
But it tells me at least one's true.
Right. Yeah.
One of these stories actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can use other evidence to prove the...
biblical story is...
Right, to prove the biblical story just by proving the accuracy and the dependability of Scripture as a whole. But I believe that the flood did happen, obviously. Yeah. And then that brings up a second question. And this is a question that a lot of scholars have debated for a long time.
Yeah.
When it says the earth, does it mean a worldwide flood?
Right.
Or does it mean the local area?
Yeah, that's...
Because that word they're using there for earth can be translated either way.
Yeah, it's Eretz. Yeah.
Does it mean that this is a flood that encompassed the entire earth?
Yeah.
Or does it mean that it's a flood that encompassed all of the area where Noah was?
Yeah, another good question. And I think that my answer to that question is yes. So we can go ahead and see you later, folks. But my answer to the question is yes. I believe that we see from the text that this is meant to be understood as a global event. So, some of that evidence that we see in the text here is that, it talks about that the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that it says all of the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. So it's not just that some of the mountains in Mesopotamia were covered. It's really clear that all of these mountains on the earth were covered, under the whole of heaven. So this is really broad language that it's using, and it says that after that in verse 21, it doesn't just say that some flesh died. It said that all flesh died that moved on the earth.
Right.
Birds and livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures, the swarm that swarm on the earth, and it says and all mankind. Mm-hmm. So we're not just talking about a few people here. Like the word used in the ESV is mankind dies here, right? And it says everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living creature that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds under the heaven. They were all blotted out from the earth. And he says at the end of verse 23, only Noah and those who were with him in the ark, they were the only ones who were left. Mm-hmm. That seems to be the understanding of the New Testament writers later on as well. Mm-hmm. Jesus talks about, in Matthew 25, right, that he talks about the day of the Lord coming later on, and he basically says that it's going to be like the days of Noah, right? That every people were just going on about their business, like they were whenever Noah was constructing the ark, right? It's going to be like that, and then they're all going to be taken away, right, by the flood that's coming. And later on too, Peter.
Peter in
First Peter
3, he actually says that in which a few, that is 8 people, survived through the waters.
Yeah, he specifically says that 8 people survived through the waters. So it seems to me, whenever we take the text at face value and we do a close reading of the text and we look at the language used there, and then after we look at that, we look at how the New Testament writers and authors and characters, whenever they reference this flood, it seems to me that they are taking it as though it is this worldwide catastrophic event. And I think that best explains why there are so many myths out there about the flood. I did a little research this week on this, and I didn't mention all of this in the sermon this morning. I wanted to save some of it for here. But here's one of the things that I found out this week. Almost every continent on the earth has a flood myth.
Yeah.
Almost, like in Asia, we don't just have the Noah flood story, but we also have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which you talked about earlier. But in China, we had what was called the Gun-Yu flood myth. The Asian islands, like the Koreas, the Philippines, and Malaysia, they have their own unique flood myths. And I'm going to butcher some of these flood stories, but the Korean one is called the Mokdor-Yung story. The Philippine story is called Ifakayu, and the Malaysian one is called Temuan. So in North America, some of our Indian tribes here, they even have their own unique flood stories. So, for example, like the Choctaw Indian tribe, they have what's called the Choctaw flood story. The Cree, and I'm assuming that these were probably some who would have maybe been involved in some of the Creole mounds that's built around the Ohio River Valley. They even had some of their own flood, and it was simply called the Cree flood story. This isn't counting some of the other Indian tribes we have in North America, like the Hopi, the Inuit, and the Eskimos. They all had their own unique flood myths. And, whenever we get to South America, we see that they had their own unique ones there as well. Like the Inca had what was called the Una Pachacuti. The Canary had the Orcarari. I'm butchering these names, but, this just goes to show that, these are real stories. You can go out and find them. This isn't just something that's just random. These are real floods. So, the question that you have to ask is, how did they all get these stories?
Right, especially if it's a flood that only happened in Mesopotamia.
Right, if it's a flood that only happens in Mesopotamia, then how does this story end up in the collective unconscious of the world?
Right.
How does that happen? Well, I think that the best answer to that question is that the flood was actually a global catastrophic event. I think that, I know that Tremper Longman says that there's not a shred of scientific evidence, for a global flood, but I beg to differ. I think that that's really, I think that maybe the only way that you can come to that conclusion if you're presupposing that there is no evidence and you're presupposing that it's a local flood only. But man, I know enough about coal mining. I've never worked at a coal mine myself, but we live here in this area that obviously where this, I've done service around coal mines for contractors and stuff like that over the years. I've never worked in them, but I know enough about the coal mines to know that what you are mining under there is like a lost world. Like you can go under there and you can find, fossils of trees and different types of animals. I actually have right here beside of me right now a fossil of a fern that one of our generous church members actually brought to us. You can't see it on camera, but Alton can see it. And it was buried under a mountain. Now, how does this tree and this just life in general get buried under a gigantic mountain like that? Well, I was reading a story this week. It was in Illinois. There were some mines there, and this mine, as they were cutting, they ran into this old ancient rainforest that used to be in that state. And I think it was either Illinois or Iowa. It was one of those I states. I can't remember now. But at one point, there was this luscious rainforest that was there. And they said that in one catastrophic event, what was the mountain that they got thrown on top of it. Now, they said that it was, millions and millions of years ago, and it was probably like, an asteroid hit it or something. They're theorizing. But basically what they're saying is the same thing. Like this catastrophic event threw this mountain of material on top of this forest. I think that is easily explained if this biblical story that we're looking at here is true and global. So
and then looking at it strictly from a biblical standpoint, I think the most clear evidence for it being a worldwide flood is what happens after the flood. God puts a rainbow in the sky.
That's right.
As a promise that he will never flood the world again.
That's right.
Right?
Yep.
Now, God didn't put a rainbow in the sky as a promise that he'd never give local area floods again.
That's right. Yeah. That would actually undo the purpose of that covenant sign, wouldn't it? Like it's to show that God will never flood the earth again. Now, if it's just only to signify that he's going to do that in local areas, what's the purpose of the sign? Right? Like he could still yet flood the world if he wanted to. So I think that just kind of undoes that purpose. And I don't think that it fits fractally. And what I mean by that is, I don't want to spend 20 minutes explaining what a fractal is, but basically what I'm trying to say is we see this same exact pattern in the creation story. So Tremper Longman actually mentions it here in his commentary that what's actually going on here is he says the flood is a reversion to the pre-creation condition, what some have called uncreation, or I call it decreation. So basically what happened was in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and how was it? What was it like? It
was formless and void.
And the waters were covering the face of the deep, right? And the Spirit's hovering over the face of the waters. So what God is doing here is he is taking this earth that has been corrupted by sin and by the curse, and he is uncreating it. He is decreating it. He is taking it back to, in Hebrew, tohu wabohu is what formless and void is in Hebrew. He takes it back to that. And then later on in the story, we're going to see a very interesting pattern emerge. We'll talk about it, I'm sure, by the end of this. But later on, Noah's going to send out a dove, which later gets this association with the Holy Spirit, and it's very much a picture of what's going on there. So to say that it's a local flood, I don't think that fits with the other patterns that we see in the Bible. So
we'll go ahead. We'll start in verse 1 here. We're 20 minutes in now. We'll touch on the passage.
Oh wow, we're already 20 minutes in. Wow. Yeah.
So we'll start here in verse 1. There's a lot of repetition here, so it's not going to take a real long time to get through the passage. Starting in verse 1. It says, "Then the Lord said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation."
Right.
So we'll stop right there for a minute.
Yep.
We just established a couple weeks ago in Genesis 6 that all the thoughts of all the men were evil always.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
And that's why God was bringing the flood to destroy the earth to begin with.
Yeah.
But then he says that Noah is righteous before him in this generation.
Yeah.
So that's interesting that God would call Noah righteous.
Yeah.
Because you get to the New Testament and you see Paul say that no one is righteous.
Right.
No, not even one.
Right.
So why would God call Noah righteous when even Paul says that no man is righteous?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's probably a couple of things going on here, but ultimately, to sum it up, I think that Noah is a seeker of the one true God. I'll put it as simple as that. I there's probably a couple different things going on here. Like he's from the lineage of Seth, which is through whom the city of God is going to come and through whom the Messiah is going to come. But I think that really we could just chalk it up to that the rest of the people in Noah's generation are like Cain and like his descendants, and they're not following after God. They're interested in building their own city and seeking their own glory. And Noah seems to be different. He seems to be very much like Enoch. Actually, the same exact language is used for Noah as Enoch was. So we saw in Genesis chapter 5, in verse 24, that Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. The same exact language is used in verse 9 of chapter 6, which we looked at last week. It says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in a generation. Noah walked with God. Same exact thing. So he's very much being portrayed like a new Enoch in some ways. He's righteous. He's a God seeker, and that's why he's righteous. Like he's trusting by faith in God, in the promise given to his ancestors, Adam and Eve, that this skull-crushing seed would one day come and all things would be put to right. And I know that you brought up earlier that perhaps there's this evidence in the next chapter that he is one who is living by faith in the commands that God has given him. Right? So,
Yeah, and we see that a couple times because it says, at the end of chapter 6, Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him.
Right.
So I think that maybe what made Noah righteous is that he kept the sacrificial system.
Yeah.
Which we can see in chapter 9, I think it will be. One of the first things that Noah does after the flood subsides is to build an ark and make a sacrifice on it.
That's right. Yep.
So I think that's part of what makes him righteous. He is keeping to the sacrificial system.
And now people may hear that and they may say, but what you're saying here is his works are making him righteous. But here's what I would say. You have to trust by faith what God is telling you about this type of system, right? Like, so for example, we know that Israel was never justified by their works. Never. But yet they have this sacrificial system, right? And God never says that they're never says that about them, right? Like that this somehow is going to justify them. No, what it is it was a matter of dependence on God, trusting that listening to His word and doing what He said would cover over or atone for their sins, right? That's not like if you looked at we
already have evidence earlier in Genesis that without faith your sacrifice is useless.
Yeah.
Look at the sacrifices of Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
That led to Abel's death. Abel's sacrifice through faith was pleasing to God.
That's exactly right.
Cain's sacrifice without faith was disgusting to God.
That's exactly right. That's 100. It's the intention of the heart whenever it comes to the sacrificial system, right? And it seems from what we see in the text that Noah's was where it needed to be,
right?
Unlike others.
So we'll get down into verse 2. It says, and this is going to be an interesting one here. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate.
Yeah.
So this is the first time we see in Scripture a distinction between clean and unclean animals.
That's right.
We don't see clean and unclean animals talked about again until the dietary laws are given in Leviticus chapter 11.
Yeah.
So why are we seeing clean and unclean here when the dietary laws have not been given? And from what we've seen, kind of up to here, it looks like they didn't eat any kind of animal at this point.
Right. Yeah. So here's my theory at the moment. This is always subject to change, but my theory at the moment is that Moses, who is writing this with these categories of clean and unclean, right? He's writing. He's the writer and the author of Genesis. He's the writer of the first 5 books of the Bible, right? The Torah. He has these categories, and he's writing. And I think that what he's probably doing is showing that this distinction that's going to come later on, biblically and theologically, starts here.
Yeah.
And later on, this category is going to get used in all kinds of really interesting ways. It's even going to get used as symbols for nations, right? And for different types of people. Like there's going to be clean and unclean, right? And that's going to fit into the whole category that we've talked about here before, which is sacred space. You've got sacred space and profane space. So this, biblically and theologically, this is going to tie in massively. And so that's what I think that Noah, or not Noah, but what Moses is doing here is he's starting to kind of drop the thread here so that you can trace it.
Right, it's kind of a literary device that he's using
that's right,
to lead people in that direction later on.
That's exactly right. Yep.
And I think I could agree with that.
Yeah.
I've not heard a better explanation for it at this point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we'll go on down to verse 3. Here it says, "And 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth." So we see, again, 7 pairs. Male and female, 7 pairs animals, 7 pairs of the birds. For in 7 days, so we're just going to keep using the number 7.
777.
Right? "I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing that I have made, I will blot out from the face of the ground." And now we're going to see that same thing again. We saw at the end of chapter 6. "And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him."
Here he is again, right? Doing what you were talking about earlier.
Every time we see Noah given a list of instructions. So chapter 6, we get the instructions for how to build the ark.
Yeah.
Build it this long, build it this wide, build it this tall, put this many rooms in it. Set it up so that it can be 3 stories. Set it up so all these animals can be in there.
Yep.
And Noah did all that God commanded him. Now God says, okay, take these animals and these animals and these animals and put them in the ark.
Yeah.
And Noah did it.
Yeah. It's interesting that the numbers there correspond with the days of creation in some ways too.
Yeah.
You've got 7 creation days. The ark, which we talked about last week, we didn't talk about, we didn't have a podcast. The ark is this microcosm of the macrocosm, or to say it another way, it's this miniature version of the universe, right? So the universe is heavens above, earth below, waters beneath the earth. The ark is 3 deckers as well, right? It's the top floor, the middle floor, and the bottom floor. And we can infer from that what's probably going to happen is the birds will probably stay on the top, right? And the the land animals will stay on this part, the second part. The creeping things would have stayed on the third, and then the swarming fish would have been underneath the waters, which would have corresponded to that model, right? And so, so that's probably, so you've got this whole thing, and then you've got the 7s that pop up here multiple, and there's a gigantic chiasm going on here too, which we haven't mentioned. I wish that I would have I drew it out this week, but I forgot to bring it with me today. But there's this giant chiasm, so that's why there's this huge amount of repetition in this. It's a literary device to try to help with memory. If you can remember the numbers, you can remember the majority of the chapter. If you can remember the 7, the 7, the 7, the 40, the 40, right, and then the 600s, right, because it's do 7s this, 7s this, 7s this. It's going to rain for 40 days, 40 nights. Noah was 600 years old. 40 days, 40 nights. The pairs come in. That's the structure of the chiasm going on here. So if you can remember that, well, you can see that I just remembered the entire chapter just from remembering those numbers, the structure of it. So, but yeah, I think that's probably why you have the 7s overlapping and repeating. Is it's used. You've got 7s used for creation. There were 7 creation days, and they're going into this micro creation. So I'm willing to change my mind on that, but right now I can't think of a better answer than that.
Right. So then we get to verse 6. Like you said, Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. So we see in, it is in the beginning. No, it is the end of Genesis 5.
Yeah.
where it says that Noah was 500. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
That's right.
Right.
Yep.
So obviously, I don't think that Noah was exactly 500 years old when he fathered all three of them.
Right.
Unless they were triplets, it's possible.
Yeah.
But I think the significance of the 500 there,
Yeah.
and then starting off with him being 600 when the floods came, is showing that 100 years
It's passed. Yeah.
from the time that God first told Noah to build an ark till the flood started.
Yeah.
I think that's the significance of those two ages given there.
You know, if you took back the events before that, at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, another 20 years prior to that, that would fit Travis Turner's interpretation that he gave of the 120 years in his sermon whenever he did that. So that, I think that fits very well.
And that also fits with, you think, who was it we talked about? It was Methuselah, right?
Yeah.
That his name basically meant he has brought his death.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that would make Methuselah's death line up with the year of the flood.
Yeah, he has brought his death, yeah. Yep.
So we have that. In verse 7, Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Mm-hmm. So we see here it is not just Noah. And without getting too far in, so we see Noah's righteousness protecting his family.
Yep.
It doesn't say anywhere that Noah's sons were righteous.
You're actually going to...
We're going to see in Genesis 9 that Noah's sons very clearly were not righteous.
Yeah. And
it's either 9 or 10.
It's 9.
Yeah.
You know, we'll touch on that, but, you know, basically the theories of his son is that he's at the very least looking at the nakedness of Noah. Mm-hmm. He could have possibly raped Noah, or some say he maybe castrated him.
Right.
You know, and there's another one, which will probably be the view that I probably take whenever we get to it, that perhaps he raped his mother, which could be why Noah curses the seed. He doesn't actually curse the son, he curses Canaan, who's going to come later. And then that's why you get this biblical theological point all throughout the New Testament, or not the New Testament, but the rest of the Old Testament, that the Canaanites are these people who have taken the land that doesn't belong to them. They're this unclean people. And in the ancient world, and you see it with Absalom and David, it was a tactic in the ancient world to take one's wife, to usurp their role as the head. And so what would happen is Absalom actually tried to take Bathsheba from David to usurp him as king. And so some think that that's maybe what's going on here. And so that's why he curses. But regardless, we'll get into that later. I may even change my mind on that before I get to that. But the point is that Noah, his family is saved explicitly in the text because of Noah's righteousness.
Right.
And this is the structure. Oh boy, this is the structure of the covenant, the covenant family. This is how covenants work. Right? Like in the ancient world, the head of the home is the one that God deals with based off their faith. Like, so for example, later on, whenever you hit, like with Abraham, right? He's going to give to Abraham this covenant, and it's going to be accompanied with this whole covenant sign thing, which is circumcision. You're going to see that Abraham's faith explicitly is mentioned, and then everybody else beneath him, under his household, his slaves included, or his workers included, they also receive the covenant sign, even though it doesn't mention that they're righteous or that they have faith. Right. They belong to the covenant because they are under his federal headship. So it's the same with Christ. Like, we're under Christ's federal headship. We're under the federal headship of Adam at one point, right? That's how the ancient world worked. So that's what's going on here in this text. We see the covenant home at work here in the text. Noah is righteous. His family is under his covenant headship. Therefore, they get to participate in the covenant and in the signs of the covenant. I'm trying not to get on a conversation about baptism, but
well, we'll save the conversation about baptism for
another time.
Well, probably about another 10 minutes. We'll probably get there.
Oh gosh.
But we see here. Just the one thing we do see for sure, without inferring anything else on Scripture, is that Noah's righteousness has provided salvation for his family.
Right.
And then getting into verse 8, it says, of clean animals, and of animals that are not clean, and of birds, and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. So we see here that there was a pair of every animal.
That's right.
Then we see, and after 7 days, the water of the flood came upon the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So they go into the ark, and they're in the ark for 7 days before the flood starts, which must have been terrible.
Yeah, I could only
That's
imagine.
a lot of animals in a boat for 7 days.
Yeah, and the waters haven't even come yet. Like,
Right.
yeah. I mean, I have chickens, and I can't stand to even go around the chickens, so.
Right, so.
They're outside even, so.
And here we are in verse 11.
Sorry, Allie.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heaven were opened. So we see we see water coming up from the ground. We see rain coming down from the sky.
Yep, double whammy.
And rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
Yep.
After that, we see on the very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth,
More repetition.
and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. They and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kinds, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, every winged creature. So we're getting...
You're coming back down the back end of the chiasm
coming
now.
back through it.
These are the 7 pairs.
The pairs coming out again here. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. So, everything that lived, 2 of them were on the ark.
Yeah.
And those that entered, male and female, of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him. Okay, and here's somewhere that I want to kind of dig in for a second.
Yeah.
Is this line in verse 16, and the Lord shut him in. There's a couple things significant there.
Yeah.
One, this boat has a huge door.
Right.
It's going to take someone really strong to close that door.
No doubt.
So there's one reason for why the Lord shut him in. But we were talking before we came on
Yeah.
about, and we'll touch back on some things we've talked about here. Noah spent 100 years building this boat. Okay? Noah lived in the desert.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you can imagine that people are going about their lives all the way up until the day of the flood. Jesus says that specifically in Matthew 25. That people are going about being given to marriage. They're doing all the things they were doing.
Going on about their business. Going on about their lives.
All the way up until the flood happens.
That's right. Yep.
So if I am living in a desert with no water anywhere to be seen, and I see a man working for 100 years to build a giant boat,
I'm thinking he's ridiculous.
right?
You're crazy. You're crazy.
I'm going to laugh at the man building the huge boat with no water anywhere near.
There's a half-done Noah's Ark going up towards like Maryland, like you hit, out of Morgantown, you're going like towards Cumberland. There's like a half-done like steel rod Noah's Ark there, and it's been there for years, and I laugh at it every time I drive by it.
Right. So it's just something that's okay.
Yeah.
This guy's building a big boat.
Yep.
And you know that people are walking by and they're laughing at him.
Yep.
And Noah, who did all the things that God commanded him, is telling these people, hey, there is a flood coming. God's going to destroy everyone that's not on this boat. And they're not listening.
Yeah.
Obviously, because nobody else got on the boat.
It's like, no, we're living in the desert, homie. Like, it's 120 degrees out here. I've got this turban on my head. I'm burning up. It's not rained. Like, I ain't got any crops. Like, you're crazy.
And I think, and this part's just coming to me as I'm thinking about it.
Yep.
This is the reason why they're in the boat for 7 days before the rain starts.
Yeah.
Because if God didn't close the door until the rain started,
Yeah.
how many people, once they finally see the rain, are going to believe?
Yeah.
And it's not faith that's making them believe.
No, it's wanting to escape judgment.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. That's good.
And so we have here the faith that is saving them, because they believed that the water would come.
It's really
They
good.
believed in what God told them. That's why they got on the boat.
That's right.
God closed the door before the rain came, so that you wouldn't have people trying to escape from judgment coming to the boat.
Yeah, gosh, you could preach a whole sermon on that.
So,
Maybe I will.
That's kind of what I want to touch on.
Yeah.
With that, and then you also have the grace shown to Noah there, because Noah's preaching to these people.
Yeah.
And I know if it's you, and you know that these people are about to die, are you going to continue preaching to them until the very last moment you can?
If this building that we're in right now is the Ark, and I've been working on it for 120 years, and I'm standing out on the porch, and I'm preaching and pleading with people to come in, I'm always going to keep the door open.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm always going to beg for them to come in. And I'm assuming it's probably very much the same with Noah.
Right.
So
I think that is the show of grace that God shows by closing the door himself. Because you don't have Noah wondering, well, what if I waited another couple minutes?
Yeah. God shut the door.
What if I waited a little longer?
God.
He doesn't have that regret or that thought.
Yeah. God has put the point on the exclamation here. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
So now we'll get into verse 17.
Yeah.
So verse 17 says, the flood continued 40 days on the earth. So we have those same
There we
numbers
go.
popping up again.
Yep. Back into the chiasm.
The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth.
This is pretty big deal. I mean, this is a gigantic ship.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's almost 2 football fields. It's like 1.5 football fields. Is about what it is. I mean, so for this, and it's constructed out of gopher wood.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so it's heavy, right? I mean, we don't know what gopher wood is. I talked about that in last week's sermon. We're not aware of a gopher tree out there anywhere. But regardless, wood is heavy, especially like when it's like wet, like it's very. So for these waters to have increased and bore up this ship, right. That's a lot of water.
Yeah, so it's a lot of water. It picks up the ship. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters.
Yeah.
So then we see, and the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. So that's what you talked about earlier.
Yep.
The waters prevailed above the mountains,
covering
them 15 cubits deep.
Above the mountains.
15 cubits, you're looking at about 23 feet.
Yeah.
So wherever you are right now, look out at the closest mountain.
Yeah.
Now look 23 feet above that mountain.
Well, that's basically what I told our congregation this morning. I said, imagine stepping out here into downtown Madison. Mm-hmm. For those of you guys who are out of sight of state, you won't know what I'm talking about. But we are surrounded by gigantic mountains. I mean, like as far up as you can look, it's mountain here, right? And I'm like, basically what I told our congregation this morning was, go out in downtown Madison, look at the mountains, and look at water above that. That's how high this water was. That's terrifying, and it just goes to show how much water we're dealing with here. I mean, it is catastrophic.
Yep. So then we get to verse 21. It says, and all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind.
Yep, it's as simple as that.
Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. Pretty obvious.
Yep.
You breathe in air, and now you're underwater.
You die.
You can't breathe. You
That's
die.
right. The breath of life is gone.
That's how that works.
That's right.
So he, like you said, God here, blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heaven. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark.
Yeah.
So, we said Peter says specifically everyone, or a select few, specifically 8 people, made it through the waters to the other side.
That's it.
And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days.
Yep.
So, just a little bit on the waters being on the earth 150 days.
Yeah.
What's the significance there? Why do you think it's significant to know that, hey, these waters were on the earth for nearly half of a year?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll be honest with you, I don't have an answer to it.
The only thing I can think of is that God wants to show, hey, there was no one treading water beside the boat.
Yeah. Yeah, that's...
No one swam through the flood and came out the other side alive.
Yeah.
It rained for 40 days.
Yeah.
And then there was water on the earth for another 150 days.
Yeah.
Nobody held their breath for 190 days.
No.
Nobody treaded water for 190 days.
No. Yeah, later on in chapter 8, you get the 150 again. At the end of the 150 days, the waters had abated. And on the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark come to rest on the mountain of Ararat. Mm-hmm. So probably a chiasm that goes on and picks up in chapter 8 with those connecting points there. But yeah, that's probably what the purpose is to show that like these waters were like this for a long time.
Right. So we see it started raining on the 2nd month on the 17th day.
Yeah.
The waters it's on the 7th month on the 17th day that the ark will come to rest on the mountain. Right?
Yep.
And then it's still another 3 months before the tops of the mountains are seen.
Yeah. That's
so
terrifying.
You're looking at 8 months of the entire earth being underwater.
Yeah, that's intense.
So that kind of goes against some of the other flood stories, right?
Yeah, right.
Flood stories that, hey, there was a flood, but this man swam through it.
Right. Yeah.
Like
this dude was a hero. Yeah, this dude's a hero.
That's not exactly possible. You're looking at 8 months of swimming through a flood.
Yeah.
So
got to be a strong swimmer for that.
Right. So we've looked at the passage. And we can go kind of to some application here. Yeah. Like I said, what we always like to ask is, where is Christ in this passage?
Yeah. So
I think you see him 2 places.
Yeah.
In two persons kind of in this passage. Mm-hmm. You see Christ in Noah.
Right.
That's the first place. Christ is in Noah because just like Noah's righteousness saved everyone who was in him, Christ's righteousness does the same today. That's why it is not any trying to do this without going into a circumcision, paedobaptism.
See, it's
debate.
It's inescapable.
Trying to avoid it, but just like, or it's the same thing as we are in Christ, and that's what makes us righteous.
Right.
With Noah, it was his family who was made righteous because he was. We are not made righteous through anything such as a baptism.
Right.
We are made righteous through being made a son of God and co-heir with Christ through Christ's righteousness.
Yep.
So that's the first place we can see Christ here in this passage.
Yeah. I touched on this a little bit in this morning's sermon, and I'll kind of pull some of it up here. So with the whole story, I made the point, as do some of the church fathers, that this story actually connects to Jesus' baptism.
Yeah.
Which is how the scriptures later on relate the flood in Noah to baptism, like in 1 Peter chapter 3. That's the logic. Right. It's the same type of logic. So basically what I said here is this. So imagine, if you would, the baptism of Jesus, right? So think about it. So Jesus shows up to the banks of the Jordan. He finds his cousin, John the Baptizer, there, right? Elizabeth, his Mary's cousin, gives birth to him. And he asked John to baptize him. What is it that he says to him? He's like, I need to be baptized by you, right? Jesus is like, we have to do this to fulfill all righteousness, right? And so that's an interesting, grammatical connection. Noah is said to have been righteous. Jesus says we need to do this to fulfill all righteousness, right? It's not as though Jesus wasn't already righteous. He's sinless, but he's doing it to fulfill things, right? And so what happens after that? So John the Baptist takes Jesus and he plunges him beneath the waters, right? And then what happens after that? You've got this amazing Trinitarian moment where Jesus, the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, arises from the baptismal waters, and then the third person of the Holy Trinity descends in the form of a dove and hovers over him in the waters, right? And then you have God the Father saying, this is my Son, whom I am well pleased, right? It's interesting there because it's the Spirit is hovering over the waters just like it did in the creation week, right? Like God makes a creation, the Spirit hovers over the waters. Jesus brings a new creation, the spirits again are hovering over the waters.
And in Jesus, when he's brought up out of the waters, the Spirit hovers over the water. What form does the Spirit take?
A dove.
Right? So
Now.
we're going to see that when we get to
It's Genesis 8, verse 8.
Genesis 8:8.
I'll go ahead and show our hand here a little bit.
Okay.
But so the question that I asked our congregation this morning was, okay, so here's the connection point between Noah and Jesus' baptism. So what is it that Noah releases over the waters to see if the waters have abated?
He releases a dove over the waters.
Genesis 8:8, it says, he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the ground. But the water found no place to set her foot, and so she returned to him on the ark, and the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So, basically, Noah sends out a dove, and what's it do? It hovers over the waters because there's no place for it to land. So it comes back to the ark, it hovers over the ark, and then it comes back down to Noah. It's the same exact pattern you see in Jesus' baptism.
Right.
The Holy Spirit, as the dove, hovers over the ark of salvation. The great wooden shepherd, as one of our kids likes to call him here at church. It refers to the ark as the wooden shepherd. He hovers, the Spirit hovers over Jesus the same way that the Spirit hovered over the waters in creation. The dove hovered over the ark, returning back in from the waters. It's the same exact, it's what I mean, it's a fractal. It's the same picture over and over and over again with just little variations here and there. So now I'm not the only person to have said that.
Right.
Okay, so I actually have a quote here. This is from St. Maximus. It's not Maximus the Confessor, it's Maximus of Turin. Two different Maximuses. But St. Maximus, this saint lived all the way back in the 400s, which is just right after the time of St. Augustine. Okay, and so listen to what he said all the way back in the 400s. So what we're saying here is very old. Like this is as old as St. Augustine. Right? He says, when Christ the Lord, therefore, initiated the sacraments of the church, a dove came down from heaven. I understand the mystery, and I recognize the sacrament, for the very dove that once hastened to Noah's ark in the flood, there's the connection point, now comes down to Christ's church in baptism. So he sees the pattern, he sees the mystery, he sees Christ present in the Old Testament there sacramentally as well. And so, but he takes it even further. It's not just that the dove descends down upon Christ in his baptism, he says, but it even comes down and descends upon us in our baptism as well, which is really interesting, which is one of the reasons I think why Peter has such high language for baptism later on in 1 Peter 3, whenever he connects that as well. So.
Yep. And then there's a whole other connection that can be made there. In Genesis 8 that we may talk about a little more next week, where the dove goes out, just like the Spirit goes out.
Yep.
And it's not yet time, so it returns.
That's right. Yep.
Until it is time, and then the Spirit or the dove is sent out, and it returns no more.
Yeah, right.
Because it has found its place on the earth.
Yeah.
There's a whole other connection that can be made there, tying it to the Spirit descending over Christ in his baptism, but then returning to where it came from.
Yeah.
Or returning to where he came from, and then descending again in the book of Acts.
Yeah.
To no longer return to where he came from.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, takes up resonance within us.
There's a whole other connection that can be made there that
really.
we may flesh out a little more next week.
Yeah, really good.
And then the second place we can see Christ in this passage, and you alluded to it a little bit there, is in the ark itself.
That's right.
So the actual vessel that carried the people of faith to safety through destruction.
And Jesus does the same thing for us. And this was really the point that I made in last week's sermon, that Jesus, the ark is a picture of Jesus, right? And so in the same way that Noah and his family entered into the ark and it saved them through the waters and from the wrath of God.
Right.
Jesus does the same with us. We enter in. That's the reason why we, like Paul literally says in Romans chapter 6, that you are united to Christ in baptism.
Right.
So it's the same thing. It's the reason why the language of union is used. Like, and you even see, like, there's even another mysterious and strange connection here, that the ark has this doorway in the side. Jesus has a wound in the side, and then what flows out of it? Water and blood. But anyway, some mysterious type of connection points, typological connection points. But yeah, Noah, Jesus is the greater ark.
Right.
So
yeah, it's pretty good stuff there. That's where we see Christ here.
Yeah.
So, do you have any more specific points of application you want to kind of touch on for this passage, or do the 2 points of where Christ is kind of cover it?
I mean, I think that this should for those who are listening who have not been baptized, this is a reason to take baptism seriously.
Yeah.
So you should follow through. Like, if you're one of those people who are listening and who has never been baptized before, but you're a follower of Jesus, you should be baptized. You should follow the Lord. And there is so much more that I could say here. There is so much more, but I think that that's all I've got, honestly.
Yeah. So
we've already been an hour.
Right. So as we're wrapping up, I'll mention a few things here, and this is kind of a little more personal stuff.
Yeah.
So as a lot of people know, people that are watching, maybe people that are listening would know, my wife and I, we just purchased a house.
Right.
So we spent the last week moving, and I've spent a lot of that week and didn't realize until this morning how tense and how just anxious I've been for the last week. And something this morning in reading through the passage before church, and then through our even in our Sunday school class this morning, we talked about how to read the Bible. And then we talked about our next series, which is going to be on justification.
That's good.
And I spent some time kind of talking to the kids a broad overview of what justification is and what that means and that kind of thing. And then through our worship this morning. And just, I was so overwhelmed all morning by the enormity of grace. And I think that is a huge takeaway from the story of Noah, is the enormity of grace. That God can reach down into the earth, pick one man, declare that man righteous. Not through works that Noah did, but declare that man righteous. Take that man, take his family, and save them from the most powerful force of destruction that the earth has ever seen. Hold them safe through all of that. Carry them through to the other side, and still fulfill the promise that was made that a Messiah would be sent through this line of people. Just the enormity of the grace of God that we have been given just really weighed heavy on me today through all of that.
That's a phenomenal point, and the personalness of that makes it even driven home even further. I got to feel some of that this morning as well. This past week has been crazy, but whenever Chris started the service off this morning, a hymn that I've not heard in years, "Victory in Jesus," and it talks about that he how does he say it? He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. And has such a thematic, it is a reminder of what Christ does. And he talks about husbands are to wash their wives with the word, and that whole thing during his scripture reading. It is a momentous reminder of the grace that God has shown to us in Christ Jesus. It's not because of anything that we've done. It's not of any of our works, but he has plunged us to victory, and we do have victory in Christ. And so,
I think we'll wrap it up there. Next week we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 8. I'm not sure how far into
I'm not either yet.
we'll be starting in Genesis chapter 8 next week.
Yeah.
So if you all have any questions on anything we've talked about today, you have any questions about what's coming up in Genesis chapter 8 with the rest of the flood story, or if you have anything, like we talked about earlier, we're going to be starting a midweek podcast every other week, talking about kind of current event things.
Yeah.
So if there's anything that comes up that you all want to hear our thoughts on, let us know. And we'd love to touch on those.
Yeah.
You can send us a message through Facebook at New Haven Church. You can comment on the video here on Facebook or on YouTube. You can send us an email. Go to newhavenwv.com, click the resources tab, and click Talks at New Haven. And there's a form there where you can submit an email. And we would love to answer any of those questions that you would have.
You can also get a hold of us now on Instagram as well, at Talks at New Haven. We do have a dedicated Instagram page now for Talks at New Haven. So any more information that you're looking for, you can find it there.
And we're going to even post something on it.
So we might even post something on it. We've not posted anything on it yet, so we need to go ahead and do that.
So that's all that I've got for today.
That's all that I have too.
I will see you all next week.
See you guys then.